Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from London. I'm Ollie Barrett and these are the top stories this hour. Novak Djokovic's lawyer says Australia's agreed to delay the tennis star's deportation after he appealed against it. His fans show support outside his hotel in Melbourne. Dozens of protesters are reportedly killed in Kazakhstan as fresh clashes break out in Almaty. This as a Moscow-led alliance sends troops to Kazakhstan. According to official data, more than 1 in 20 people in Britain, or an estimated 3.7 million people, had COVID-19 in the last week of 2021. France hits Google and Facebook with a fine worth $237 million over their use of cookies, the data used to track users online. And music's Grammy Awards, scheduled to take place in Los Angeles later this month, are postponed indefinitely because of the rapid spread of the Omicron variant. And we'll start in Australia, where Novak Djokovic, the world #1 men's tennis star, remains at an immigration detention centre in Melbourne after he was stopped by Border Patrol officials on arrival. Djokovic had received a special last-minute permission to play in the Australian Open, which is scheduled to begin on January 17th. He'd secured a medical exemption from Australia's Victoria state government, but federal border authorities did not accept the exemption. He refused to reveal his vaccination status and the grounds of his medical exemption, and the Australian government revoked Djokovic's visa and denied him entry. After being made to wait over 8 hours at Melbourne's Tullamarine Airport, the tennis star was transported to an immigration facility in Melbourne. After Djokovic's lawyers argued against his deportation, the governments agreed to wait. The Australian Prime Minister defended his government's decision.
Rules are rules. And there are no special cases. Rules are rules. It's what I said to you yesterday. That's the policy of the government and has been our government's strong border protection policies, and particularly in relation to the pandemic, that has ensured that Australia has one of the lowest death rates from COVID anywhere in the world. It is not appropriate for me to go into Mr Djokovic's own medical history. That would not be a fair thing for us to do. They are matters for him to discuss in terms of his own medical history. But all I can say is that the evidence for medical exemption that was provided was found to be insufficient.
The rules are pretty clear. All participants at the first Grand Slam of 2022 must be vaccinated or have a medical exemption. Exemption is granted only after assessment by 2 panels of independent experts. Among the conditions allowing entry without a vaccine is if a person has had COVID-19 in the past 6 months. But we don't know if that's the case with Djokovic. Tournament chief Craig Tiley says the defending champion had been given no special favour. And reporter Adam Hancock has given us more from Sydney.
Well, it's been an extraordinary set of circumstances here in Australia. We first got wind a couple of days ago that Novak Djokovic was granted an exemption to enter the Australian Open. Remember, the Australian Open have quite strict regulations in terms of staff and players needing to be fully vaccinated. So we understood that he did have an exemption from Tennis Australia and the Victorian government. He took to social media. He went on his Instagram account, made a post saying that he'd received an exemption. He was looking forward to flying to Australia and trying to win the Australian Open. Now, he arrived here in Australia last night, very late, on a flight from Dubai. He got to the border, expected to be allowed into the country, head off to his hotel and begin practicing for the main event in a couple of weeks. But then he was questioned by the Australian border forces, who were not happy with the exemption and the circumstances around the exemption that he had received. Therefore, he was questioned for a number of hours. He was kept in a separate room in the airport. His father was very angry about the situation. He said he was in a specific room with an armed guard outside of the room. It was a number of hours later before we heard word that the Australian border officials were not happy with the exemption and the circumstances around his visa. We were then told that he would not be allowed into the country. His visa would be revoked and he would effectively be deported. Djokovic was then taken to a hotel in Melbourne. As you mentioned earlier, it was an immigration facility. It's been a little bit infamous recently. There was a fire there, also a COVID outbreak. But it's really opened up a lot of questions. Firstly, what were the terms of the exemption that he was given? We understand that 26 players and officials applied for exemptions to play at the Australian Open without being fully vaccinated, and only a handful were given the right to enter the country. So what was the difference between their case and Djokovic's? Also, why was he allowed to board the plane in the first place if this was going to be an issue? So there's lots of questions, a little bit of finger pointing going on between the federal government, Tennis Australia, the state government. Nobody quite clear exactly who has made the decisions and on what grounds.
Some Australian sports fans threatened to boycott the Australian Open after Djokovic was allowed to play, but he's also been receiving supportive messages as well. His fans were hoping to see him claim his 21st major title, and many of them gathered outside the Melbourne quarantine centre where he's now holed up.
We've come down here to support him. It's not fair. It's being discriminating against him just because he chooses not to state, his vax status. I mean, it is a personal choice. So, like I said to the guys before, he shouldn't be, telling people what his actual status are. This is his job. He's here to play.
But hang on, tennis players got exemptions. Why aren't they sent back home? Is that true?
Thank you, Australia, for locking down like a refugee, like a criminal. Thank you so much, really. I'm so upset. Thank you so much.
There's a hotel across from the Tullamarine Airport, why not there?
The British government has decided to scale back restrictions on people travelling to England. Vaccinated travellers will no longer need to take a test before their journey to the UK. However, they will still need to take one within 2 days of arrival. The changes are being welcomed by the country's hard-hit aviation and tourism industries. The Prime Minister informed Parliament that cases were increasing at the fastest rate ever. Johnson also says hospitalisation is rising higher in older age groups. But the Prime Minister says he's confident the country can get past the Omicron wave with the current level of restrictions.
I'm confident that we can get through this wave of Omicron with the measures, with the balanced and proportionate approach that we are taking. And I'm glad to have her support, Mr. Speaker. And for the future, what we need is the multivalent, the polyvalent vaccines that can deal with any type of COVID mutation, any type of variant, as well as the therapeutics, Mr. Speaker. And that is what we're investing in.
Back to those changes for international travel. So fully vaccinated travellers coming to the UK will not have to take a pre-departure test. And from Sunday, when they arrive here, they can take a cheaper lateral flow test rather than a PCR. And they will no longer need to isolate on arrival until they get a negative test result. Unvaccinated passengers, however, will need to continue taking a pre-departure test, PCR tests on day 2 and day 8, and to self-isolate for 10 days.
Midday.
Giles Gibson joins us live now from London. Giles, why is the government making these changes now?
Well, Ollie, a lot of these restrictions were introduced or reintroduced after the emergence of the Omicron variant at the end of last year. The theory was that they would buy time for the United Kingdom, just delay the arrival of that new variant on these shores. But of course, a couple of months later, we now have roughly 200,000 new coronavirus cases every single day. And Omicron has really very much established its presence here. And we had Grant Shapps, the UK Transport Secretary, announcing these changes, really admitting that now they are really not essential because, as he put it, Omicron is global now. This decision has certainly been welcomed very much by the UK travel industry, which has just seen bookings going off a cliff in the weeks after the emergence of Omicron and these tougher restrictions being brought in. The Airport Operators Association saying that this is a welcome recognition that these restrictions no longer serve a purpose. And we're also seeing this reflected on the stock markets, with travel and airline shares in particular really getting a bit of a bump in the wake of these restrictions being scaled back, including IAG, International Airlines Group, which is the owner of British Airways, which has really seen its share price rising pretty steadily over the course of the week.
And well, on that point, Giles, does all of this open up the possibility of a more normal 2022 tourist season to and from the UK?
Well, we certainly had a hint from the UK Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, in an interview that he gave just a couple of hours ago, that we could see more of these restrictions, more of these sort of travel measures being stripped back over the coming months. He said he could see a world in which you didn't need to do testing at all. Of course, Ollie, there are two things that the UK government absolutely has no control over. The first one is what other countries decide to do. So you still, of course, have countries such as the United States that are requiring travellers to get a test in a really tight window, just 24 hours before they get on a plane and travel over to the United States. And the UK government also can't control whether we see new variants of the coronavirus popping up in the coming months, because, of course, these restrictions, which they are now pulling back, were only really brought in after the emergence of Omicron, and lots of concern about whether it was going to be much more infectious than previous variants, and also about whether it was going to evade vaccines.
OK, Giles, so still lots of uncertainty. Thank you. That's Giles Gibson reporting from London. And the Omicron variant is rampant in much of Europe. France has set a record for new COVID cases. More than 300,000 new infections were recorded over the last 24-hour period. That's the first time that French daily confirmed cases breached the 300,000 mark. 66,000 people in France received their first COVID jab on Wednesday.
Lutter contre cette pandémie supposait bien sûr toute une série d'actions, on ne va pas les énumérer ici, supposait évidemment l'adoption de dispositions législatives ou réglementaires, mais reposait aussi sur la responsabilité individuelle de chaque citoyen de la République. Et oui, les citoyens de la République doivent exercer leur responsabilité. Et être responsable, être libre, ce n'est pas contaminer impunément les autres. Ce n'est pas surcharger nos services de soins qui sont déjà soumis à rude épreuve.
In Italy, in a bid to battle surging infections, the government is making COVID vaccination compulsory for everyone over the age of 50. From February the 15th, the vaccine pass will be necessary for people over 50 to access their workplace. Out of Italy's 59 million population, 28 million are over the age of 50. Some 78% of Italy's population is fully vaccinated. So far, around 36% have received a booster shot.
L'estensione dell'obbligo vaccinale a tutti i cittadini del nostro Paese che hanno più di 50 anni. Questo verrà controllato in modo particolare nei luoghi di lavoro attraverso l'utilizzo del Green Pass rafforzato.
Next to the Netherlands, which has also recorded its highest number of COVID cases ever registered in a single day. The new record stands at nearly 25,000 positive tests. Despite that rapid rise in infections, hospital admission numbers continue to decline. The Netherlands currently has one of the strictest sets of antivirus measures in place. All non-essential shops, restaurants, bars and entertainment venues are closed until January the 14th. Universities and other higher education institutions remain closed as well and have been restricted to online learning. To Czechoslovakia now, and as the Omicron strain of COVID-19 is expected to spread further there, the health minister has announced all Czech employees will have to undergo antigen tests twice a week. The measure will take effect on January the 17th. It'll impact all employees going to regular workplaces. It includes vaccinated employees as well as those who've recently recovered from COVID-19. The government will also trim the quarantine and isolation periods to 5 days each as of January the 11th. There are fears the rapid spread of Omicron could lead to workforce shortages. The country of 10.7 million people has registered more than 2.5 million COVID-19 cases and almost 36,400 deaths. In Germany, critical services could grind to a halt as the highly infectious Omicron variant takes hold. That's why the German government is considering shortening COVID-19 self-isolation periods like many other countries. Workers in critical sectors such as hospitals or electricity supply could be able to end their isolation after 5 days. For the general population, the isolation period would be reduced to 7 days with a negative PCR test. The current isolation period is 14 days for everyone. The draft proposals are being sent to regional leaders who will meet with Chancellor Olaf Scholz on Friday. Under the plans, people who show no symptoms after 10 days of isolation will be allowed to leave their homes without a test. Hours after the announcements, several hundred people took to the streets of Munich to protest against the government's COVID restrictions. Daily infections were declining in December, but started rising again a week ago. What started as a protest against rising fuel prices in Kazakhstan has quickly turned violent and spiralled into anti-government demonstrations. The situation has escalated to the point that the first batch of a Russian-led peacekeeping force has been deployed to help try and stabilize the country. With the internet shut down, the true extent of violence is not clear. For now, Kazakh media have reported that dozens of protesters have been killed in the city of Almaty when they tried to storm government buildings. On Thursday, several armoured personnel carriers and dozens of troops entered the main square of Almaty, where hundreds of people were protesting against the government. Meanwhile, the National Bank of Kazakhstan reportedly decided to suspend the work of banks in the country for the safety of its workers. It's the third day of protests, and there are also reports that demonstrators have surrounded 2 large hospitals in Almaty and aren't letting patients and medical staff inside. Residents of the city have been informed that an anti-terrorism operation is going to take place, and they've been asked to take shelter and stay away from windows. So far, 8 police and National Guard troops have been killed, and over 1,000 people have been injured in the unrest, which has taken place in several regions of Kazakhstan. In the country's largest city of Almaty, gunshots were heard near the mayor's office and the building was set on fire. The president quickly imposed a nationwide state of emergency and denounced the protesters as terrorists and bandits who seized 5 planes from Almaty's airport and targeted buildings where arms are located. The president also said that he'd appealed for help to a Russian-led alliance in quelling the protests.
На самом деле это уже не угроза. На самом деле это подрыв целостности государства. И самое главное, это нападение на наших граждан, которые просят меня, как главу государства, в срочном порядке оказать им помощь.
The oil-rich country of 19 million is estimated to have 1 million people living below the poverty line, but it also has several billionaires on the Forbes list. One of the 5 ex-Soviet nations in Central Asia, Kazakhstan is a crucial economic partner to Russia and home to a large ethnic Russian population. Moscow is calling for a peaceful solution through dialogue and not through riots. The Grammy Awards, which were scheduled for the end of this month, have now been postponed indefinitely. It's the second year in a row that the Grammys have been pushed back. The decision comes as Omicron cases rise in the United States.
The Grammy Awards have been postponed for a second year in a row, with organizers on Wednesday citing a surge in cases of the Omicron coronavirus variant. The Grammys, which honors the top performances in music, was scheduled to take place at the end of the month. Organizers had hoped for a return to a more traditional celebration, complete with a large audience inside the former Staples Center, now called the Crypto.com Arena. Last year's celebrations were held in March instead of January and featured a mix of pre-recorded and live segments in front of a small, socially distanced crowd. But the Grammys were not the only awards event disrupted by Omicron. The Sundance Film Festival is going virtual following a cancellation of in-person events, while the Critics' Choice Awards, meant for this Sunday, has been postponed with no new date scheduled.
Hollywood was not expecting this.
Mark Malkin is the senior editor at Variety magazine.
Hollywood has to be really careful with, if they're trying to bring back award season, they can't look like they don't care. They can't look like they're not, have the empathy for all the suffering that's going on out there. So I think if, they sort of take a few steps back with a bunch of these award shows, it's okay. And then really celebrate at the Oscars, I think they could be forgiven.
Award season traditionally ends with the Oscars, also known as the Academy Awards, which are expected to be held in late March.
Christmas has finally arrived for children in Madrid with an extravagant and colourful parade of the Three Kings. So happy Christmas again. I'm Ollie Barrett. Thanks for watching WION World is One.
Additional rice, Arab.